So stress is something we can all relate on. We're all feeling it, thinking about it, oftentimes talking about it. And usually when we talk about it, we're referring to stress as this awful thing. It feels terrible, it's impacting our health, so we're trying to get rid of it, avoid it. And as much as we hate on stress, so many of us are feeling pretty high and constant levels of stress on a very regular basis. So just as strong and constant as the stress we're feeling is this never-ending battle to reduce, avoid, counteract, and eliminate this stress. In a later video on this series, I'll also talk about the opposite. Some people, many of us, actually find ourselves compulsively drawn into stress and drama because there is something about stress that kind of enhances our sense of being alive and sometimes can give life more meaning. So whether you hate stress and want to get rid of it, or sometimes find yourself sort of addicted to it, this series is here to help us understand stress and its impacts in a more nuanced way. Because research shows us that not all stress is harmful. There are different types of stress that we can break down that have very different impacts. The biggest thing to remember for this video is how much stress and how long we're under that stress is what makes the biggest difference, as well as things like what time in our life, especially childhood, we experience that stress. From what we're coming to understand about stress, we can break it down into toxic stress, which is the stress everyone might think about right off the bat. That's going to come with all those negative effects on our physical and mental health that you usually think of. Even within toxic stress, though, I'll actually separate it out to acute toxic stress or chronic long-term toxic stress. The much less discussed type of stress is positive stress, and despite feeling uncomfortable and bringing a lot of that same tension and strain, positive stress actually has some really beneficial effects. Positive stress can allow us to know and trust ourselves more deeply, and again, enhance our sense of meaning in life. In between these two poles of positive and toxic stress, we've got tolerable stress. And understanding what makes the difference is something that can help us keep even really big and severe stressful events in a tolerable range, helping make some of those long-term impacts of that stressful event neutral and potentially even more positive than negative. So before we break down all the types of stress in this series, let's define what stress is. That sounds simple, but we oftentimes get stress and anxiety mixed up. And there are actually important differences between the two. We'll start with what's similar. They feel pretty similar. Both are going to cause a lot of worry, uneasiness. We'll have physical tension, even pain sometimes. Heart rate goes up, hormones firing, changes in our sleep and appetite. So that's what they've got in common. But if we look at stress first, stress is a natural and unavoidable response to challenging external situations or adversity. It's time limited. Our stress response usually resolves once the situation resolves, unless it is toxic or becomes chronic. And the impacts of stress can be positive to negative, or anywhere in between. If we take anxiety, on the other hand, anxiety comes more from an internal source. It may not have anything to do with the events that are actually happening to us, so it's coming from how we react to stress. Anxiety can be triggered from events that happened long in the past, or far out in the future, potential threats we've never experienced, or even just come from thoughts and feelings that have no external source. Anxiety feels like that more persistent sense of dread or apprehension, which can be totally constant or go up and down in waves. So the key difference here is stress ties to specific situations, whereas anxiety is internal and it can persist and exist without a clear cause. So good news, because anxiety is an internal reaction, we do have a lot more control over it. We can't avoid life being stressful, but anxiety is something, it may feel involuntary and unconscious and out of our control, but there are things that we can do to actually change and heal that stress response. As I say this, I want to be very clear that just because we can learn how to heal anxiety, that doesn't mean it's your fault if you're experiencing it. Again, it starts off as a very unconscious and involuntary process. Where does anxiety actually come from? Generalized anxiety and most common mental health symptoms come from emotional schemas, or core beliefs. In therapy, I call them emotional truths that we hold about ourselves, others, and the world. And there's a really learned, intergenerational, and cultural aspect to anxiety. For example, sometimes we develop anxiety because we have anxious responses to stress modeled to us by our family, peers, our culture at large. Sometimes we receive messaging that being anxious and expecting the worst is smart, strategic, or helpful. And sometimes we learn anxiety because we were just never given other tools of coping with stress or a more positive way of approaching challenges and looking at ourselves and the world. Core beliefs and emotional schemas that drive anxiety are usually created unconsciously. They're created most often in childhood through significant emotional experiences. And these emotional schemas, they're built into our memory system. So they're very resistant to change. Even if that core belief or emotional truth has become really outdated, is totally irrelevant, and is causing us a lot of pain and anxiety in our present day lives. Having said that, emotional schemas, core beliefs, these are changeable with the right tools and support. If you want to deep dive into this, please go to my video on memory reconsolidation. That's where I really dig into what core beliefs actually are and the research we have on how to change them. Takeaway for today: even though anxiety is one of the most common mental health issues, it is treatable. It can go away. I think this is something that therapists don't always say clearly. We might hedge around it or say, oh, anxiety can reduce, you can expect it to gradually get better over time. That is true. And with the right type of support, we have specific processes we've developed to actually eliminate anxiety, so you don't have to live feeling this way for the rest of your life. No matter how deeply ingrained your anxiety may feel, just know somewhere in the back of your head after watching this video that this doesn't have to be your reality forever. It's really by uncovering and going into those roots of anxiety in your emotional memory that we can shift from an unconscious, anxious reaction to stress and respond to stress in more chosen and empowering ways. The first step in this process is shifting consciously and rationally how we understand stress, so we can approach different types of stress differently and use more helpful, specific strategies, because the way that we're going to manage a mildly stressful event and what we're going to need to get through that is going to be really different than what we need for a toxic or more severely stressful event. So super excited to dive into this with y'all. The next video we're going to have is on positive stress, which is the least talked about type of stress. So definitely tune back in for that one.